Sunday school teachers. I wanted to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about preparing for teaching a Sunday school lesson. I wanted to give you a little insight on my own process. And this is a process I use regardless of whether I'm teaching from a curriculum or I am coming up with a lesson that is just on a passage of scripture that I'm just completely making up. And the first thing that I do when I'm preparing a Sunday school lesson, and I'm sure that this is something you probably do too, is I pray. I take a few minutes and I talk to God and I just ask Him to give me insight and wisdom as I approach a passage of scripture. And after I do that, I look at the passage of scripture for the week. Now, if it is from a curriculum, I'll see which ones they want, or I'll read the one that I have chosen, and I will just simply read it. Before I really look at any of the other information or think about anything else, I just read the passage of scripture and I write down anything that stands out to me or mark something that stands out to me. I write down any questions that come up, whether questions I have or questions that I think would be good to talk about, or any other thoughts. I just kind of give an initial read through and thinking on the passage. And after I spend some time meditating and reading and thinking about this passage of scripture, then I'll go back and look, especially if I'm reading and working with a curriculum, I'll go back and look at the curriculum. I'll spend some time on the main summary page. Most curriculum has a main summary page. The one we've been using for GC2 Press has a summary page both in the student guide and the teaching guide. And I'll look at the passage of scripture that they have. I'll look at the main focus question and the main goals of the lesson and try to get an idea of what the writer of the curriculum is wanting to convey through this lesson. The next thing I do specifically with our GC2 Press curriculum is I like to get the study guide. And our study guides are really great. They have some questions at the end of every lesson. And so, for instance, lesson 3 had 4 different questions. And I'll go, and before I've read everything, I'll go and read those discussion questions. And then I will maybe mark some that I think would be interesting topics for conversation in our groups and kind of say, oh, I think that would be an interesting thing to talk about and discuss. This also helps me get an idea of what everybody has the opportunity to read during the week, because ideally people are reading through their study guides in preparation for Sunday school on Sunday mornings. And so it'll give me an idea of what are they going to come ready to talk about and have reflected over the last week. The next thing I will do after I've kind of started to get my mind wrapped around both what I think about what the scripture says, what it seems like the curriculum writers are wanting people to think about, the next thing I will do is I will go and read supplemental material on the passages of scripture. So whether that is reading the background information in the teaching guide or in the study guide, or I will look at a commentary on that passage of scripture. Our GC2 Press stuff comes with verse by verse commentary on each passage of scripture that are the main ones for a lesson. So I will go and read that information. I'll try to get a sense of the context for the passage. Now, if we were studying a book of the Bible, that context is going to be something that is going to grow as we go through a book. But when we're doing a topical study, it's really helpful to zero in and say, okay, this person has chosen to talk about the book, this part of Acts. Well, what's happening around it? Where does this passage fit in to the larger story? And I kind of jot down some of those interesting tidbits, also things I think that might help as we have a conversation about that passage of scripture. I also will pay particular attention to explanations of any difficult passage, any difficult verse or word, or especially if I have had a question as I've been reading through the scripture. If I'm like, oh, I don't know if I totally understand this, I'll make sure for sure to go and dive into those passages to make sure I'm able to understand and explain. Because most likely, if I've had a question about something, then someone else is going to have that question as well. And by the same token, if I think something is very interesting or intriguing, there's a good chance other people are going to think that as well. So I'll make note of those things because they'll be interesting points for conversation as we sit down to have our Sunday school class. So after I have gotten a sense of the passage of scripture and written down my own thoughts and looked at the questions in the student guide and read supplemental material, then I pick up both the teaching guide and the study guide. of the curriculum and I say, okay, what are some things that I think from both of these that would be interesting things to talk about in our class? What are going to drive us at that main goal point? And I pick maybe 3 to 5 questions, maybe a combination of them from the study guide, also from the teaching guide. And I try to kind of plot a course using some of those things. And sometimes I just add my own questions because I think that they'll work differently, because you, at the end of the day, as a teacher, know your class. You know the people, you know some of the things they struggle with, you know the things that tend to get people talking in your class. And so it's important to think about that whenever you're choosing questions to ask or coming up with your own. And as I am plotting my course through the lesson, regardless of what questions I end up picking, I use the method of hook, book, look, took mostly. I don't necessarily always think about those things, but I always want to have some sort of a hook, some sort of a discussion starter or opening activity. And the way I like to think about an opener is either you want an opening activity that's going to be focused around building relationships with people in your group, or you want one that's going to be a discussion starter. And so, for instance, in the one for lesson 3 of the disciple making series, one of the opening discussion starters is to read the book of The Very Hungry Caterpillar and to use that as a conversation starter. And that's a great way to start things off. But another way would be to do something that is intentionally engaging, that gets people talking to one another and getting to know more about each other in a fun way, in a lighthearted way, help people feel comfortable in the group. And sometimes I'll do more than one if I think it will be beneficial. And the next thing I would do as I was planning through a lesson is then you're going to want to read scripture and discuss it. And so I will decide based on the group, this would be a great place to put in table discussions, give people things to think and talk about together as a smaller group, if that works for your group. But essentially, reading through a passage of scripture and talking about it. And I think it is always okay to start with simply what stood out to you and why did that stand out to you? Those 2 questions can get you very far in facilitating discussion, especially the what stood out to you. Because all of us have things that we notice or think about whenever we read scripture. And it is possible to spend an entire lesson just talking around those things that stood out. Now, if we have a goal in mind of wanting to get to a certain point, then we may want to try to facilitate the conversation to go in a certain direction. And that's why usually I pick 3 to 5 questions that I really like, that I think will help drive home the main point of what we're trying to discuss. And I will and sometimes I just write them out on a list and I ask them in the way that makes sense based on how the conversation is going in the room. So I may ask my first question last if that is how the conversation went, based on what people noticed in scripture or just on what people are even interested in talking about that day. And then one other thing I would put in here is that often especially whenever it's a topical study, curriculum tends to pick multiple passages of scripture. And while that is helpful and beneficial, it can also be a little overwhelming. So it is always okay to zero in on 1 or 2 main texts and really dive into those. So after I have plotted my way through the study guide, the teaching guide, and given myself a fairly decent roadmap, I will try to come up with one challenge or question or takeaway to leave people with. And sometimes it's okay to let people ask the question of, well, what is your takeaway? What is something you're going to continue thinking about as we leave today? What has been the thing that stood out to you the most or has been the most impactful in our conversation today? Sometimes that's a good way to do it. But it's also good to say, well, the challenge for us this week is to reflect on this and to think about how we can live this out in this way. Or maybe a brainstorm, a quick little brainstorm about how can we live this out as a group this week. All of those are really great ways to end a lesson. And then the final thing I do is I pray again. And often, praying in and all throughout is definitely something I do as well. But I try to make sure I begin and end with prayer. That's a very important aspect of connecting with God and what he wants to do in the lives of people. So I hope this has been a helpful conversation today of what my process and preparation looks like. Of course, yours may look a little bit different. You're not me, and that's okay. So find what works for you. How is it that you best prepare to lead a conversation and do it? And if you want to talk more about this, I would love to chat about it. Feel free to reach out. I'd love to help give some more pointers or hear some of the ways that you find helpful in preparing. We can always be learning from each other. So feel free to reach out and contact me if you have anything to say. I'll see you next time. Bye.